Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, October 28th, 2023, and officially today, Vice President Mike Pence has dropped out of the 2024 presidential election, months out from the first primary that is set to occur, or caucus rather, in the state of Iowa. Then heading straight into the state of New Hampshire, Vice President Mike Pence has announced that he's suspending his bid for the presidency of the United States of America. Now, Mike Pence has been in the race for quite some time, nearly a year now, and has been very, very adamant that he was going to be in this race to win it, nearly always answering questions to reporters that he believed that he was a viable option for Republican voters in the 2024 GOP primary. But as the months went on, we started to see that Mike Pence wasn't gaining any traction nationwide. Mike Pence, who is polling at 3.5% nationwide as the former vice president, has now seemed to decide that this no longer is his choice, that he doesn't have an opportunity outside of where he was and outside of where he is today. Now, Mike Pence started out with a lot more support than where he currently stands. When polls were first being taken back in 2022, Mike Pence was nearing around 10% nationwide. And while that isn't the most impressive number for the former vice president, it's certainly a lot higher than after months of campaigning, only to be perceived and viewed less as a viable option than where he started off. Going down from 10% down to 9%, then to 7%, and pretty consistently saying around 7% until around the time of April 2023, when he started to take a dip and started to be below candidates like Nikki Haley, even Vivek Ramaswamy, and a bunch of others. But as the numbers went on and as the time went on, Mike Pence was still polling around 5th place nationwide. He was polling ahead of candidates like Tim Scott even today, Chris Christie, Asa Hutchinson, Doug Burgum, and I mention these candidates in specific because they are all candidates that Mike Pence is leading right now nationwide, yet are still remaining in the race. It's quite interesting, if you ask me. And it feels very reminiscent of where we were back in 2016, when we saw a number of candidates stay in the race because they might have been able to poll higher in prior elections and in prior polling groups, but eventually started to fall flat when it came down to the nomination process, i.e. the primaries and caucuses that took place in the actual 2016 election year. But this is breaking news. Mike Pence hasn't really led on to much of the reason behind his campaign. I imagine that there will be some level of investigation and internal inquiries from the GOP and the Pence campaign to figure out what went right and what went wrong. Because for a lot of people, Mike Pence was never going to be that guy, right? Mike Pence was never going to be the GOP nominee. And so a lot of questions are going to be raised. Why did you run in the first place? We can see on the timeline of candidates here. Let's see if we have the entrance into the polls, or entrance into the races. Mike Pence announced sometime in mid-2023. In fact, many other candidates announced before him. This was a long time coming, including candidates like Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Asa Hutchinson, Vivek Ramaswamy, Tim Scott, Larry Elder, right? All of these candidates that right now are not being perceived as the strongest, or are being perceived as more stronger than Mike Pence. He is probably one of the few candidates who announced very late in the game, but still has been in this race for quite some time, and yet is failing to capture a significant chunk of the vote. So I was actually wrong earlier on when I said that he was in the race for almost a year. In fact, it's one of the shorter campaigns that we will see in this election cycle. I don't know why. I guess there was a lot of conversation around him running because he was campaigning for people like Karen Taylor Robson in Arizona in 22, campaigning for other Republicans across the country. But besides that point, Mike Pence isn't doing so well. And, now that he's withdrawing himself from the race, I'm interested to see where he throws his support. So it says he made this announcement at the annual Republican Jewish Coalition convention. They talk about how he struggled to campaign. He spoke at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, and, talked about Donald Trump, talk about, his lawyers, all of that. And, I think it was really difficult for him to gain any support amongst the Trump base and amongst the anti-Trump base. I mean, he sort of alienated himself by being both associated with Donald Trump and disassociating himself with Donald Trump. He wasn't someone who came into, the sphere either entirely one-sided, and he doesn't play it as well as Ron DeSantis, who has been long seen as in opposition to Donald Trump's presidential campaign. There also is the fact of the matter that the third Republican debate has raised the threshold yet again as to who will be on the stage. In the first debate, you remember that there were a number of candidates. You just needed 1% support. You needed to meet a certain fundraising threshold. And by the second debate, they raised it to 3% nationwide or 3% in any of the early states, which more candidates got, but some had to pull out, right? Frank Suarez, who dropped out of the race. Asa Hutchinson was no longer on that debate stage. It became more difficult. And now for the third Republican debate, we are looking at here that those who have qualified, confirmed and qualified, are Governor Ron DeSantis, President Donald Trump, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Chris Christie, right? These are all people that are qualified for the third debate, but you know who's not on there? Governor Doug Burgum, who currently serves as the governor of the state of North Dakota. Yet again, the remaining candidates on the list, Asa Hutchinson, who refuses to pull out of the race. Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina is a big one as well. Of course, and you might notice this now because he's dropped out, but largely in part of this, Vice President Mike Pence. So when this debate comes up, November 8th, the day after the Virginia, Kentucky elections, the ones that we're taking a close look at, it'll be interesting because to qualify now, candidates must poll at least 4% in 2 national polls or 4% in 1 national poll and 1 early state poll. But here's the problem. When you look at a lot of these polls and you look at the nationwide, 4% isn't going to be super easy. Mike Pence might have been able to make it there, but you keep looking, right? Chris Christie has 1. Tim Scott has 0. Asa Hutchinson has 0. Doug Burgum has 0, and that's a problem. Even in some instances, Vivek Ramaswamy will qualify, but 4% is starting to, get to a point where maybe he won't make it, right? You raise it to 5, well, he's not even averaging 5 at this point in time. But then you have to take a look at the early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. Well, in Iowa, let's see where you have the other candidates. Okay, Tim Scott might be able to make it because he's polling high in Iowa, sure. Mike Pence was doing well, but in the most recent one, seems as if might be driving the reason for his suspension, he's at 1% instead of 6%, where he was weeks ago. You take a look at New Hampshire, let's see, okay, Mike Pence wouldn't even have qualified from New Hampshire polls, polling at 1% in one of the early primary states, and he spends a lot of time there too. And in South Carolina too, Mike Pence is at 2.8%. The threshold, I think, will be at a point where by the time we reach the debate stage, I do believe there will be probably the same candidates that were there at the second debate. But it's difficult right now because a lot of them haven't qualified at this point. It's a display of weakness. It shows that once you raise the threshold instead of 4% to 6%, a lot of candidates will be pushed out of the race and will drop out of the race in the way that Mike Pence has. It's also a question, too, about whether or not it's time for this primary to be declared over. I made a video talking about how Donald Trump's lead is only continuing to grow and grow and grow, and that's a problem fundamentally for the other Republicans, because right now, Donald Trump being with a 46.5% advantage as a non-incumbent is cataclysmic to anyone else who might be choosing to run in this race. And they know that, right? I think a lot of them are vying for the vice presidential spot, but I don't imagine, because Donald Trump is very big on loyalty, and we saw it even in 2016, that he doesn't want to run with someone who just actively ran against him. And looking at the narratives that have been spun by every single candidate with the exception of Vivek Ramaswamy, all of them have been attacking Donald Trump, and I don't think he wants to run with someone who he knows will probably drag down that ticket. But just looking at where we are in comparison to 2016, let's narrow this up to about a year out from the election. So you're talking May 2015, primary ended around May 2016. So to get to this point, we're talking around October. And looking at the date, the 28th, let's see exactly where we were 8 years ago today. Donald Trump in a lead by just 4.8%. Isn't that crazy? I'm sure Republicans would love to see that now. 4.8%. Ben Carson within striking distance. Just weeks later, will have overcame Donald Trump nationwide, but very, very interesting there. Ben Carson there, and the rest of the candidates at single digits or less. Now, we know that as the field starts to clear, that isn't always going to be the case, but the big factor of it all is that Donald Trump is in the lead right now with 59% of the vote on average. In 2016, it was around 46.5% by the end, but even at this point, just 26.8%. It is a truly remarkable gain and growth for the former president, who for a while Republicans thought voters were going to write off because of the abysmal 2022 midterm election performance. But very obviously, that is not true. I also want to say the reason I bring up 2016 is because it brings an interesting point about timelines, right? Scott Walker, who at one point was in second place nationwide, fell out of favor and dropped out nearly immediately. And many candidates decided to stay in the race. I mean, we can see here that at this point in time, George Pataki was in the race, right? Lindsey Graham had still been considering this. Rick Santorum was in the race. Carly Fiorina, Rand Paul, Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, Ben Carson, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and of course Donald Trump, right? A lot of these candidates were still in the race at this point in time, well after the process, and were holding out strong. But the difference is that Trump's lead was 34 and not 58. And that's why I think we're starting to see dropouts this early on because, Will Hurd is gone. Francis Suarez is gone. Harry Johnson is gone. Now you start to see Larry Elder is gone. And also now you will find that Mike Pence is also gone. A lot of candidates that have been in this race have started to drop, and frankly, they weren't polling super well, but nobody is. Nobody is polling super well. The best performing Republican besides Donald Trump is at 12.6%. Even when Ted Cruz was at 27%, he dropped out. Kasich was at 18%, he dropped out. And yet for some reason, people are so convinced, politicians more than voters, are so convinced that they have such an electable position, when in reality, that simply is not true. So I look at 2016 as a point of reference for dropout dates, but also because it shows a fascinating story about how Donald Trump's lead was so insurmountable that nobody thought they were going to be able to challenge him. And yet for some reason, his lead is dramatically higher now, and everybody seems to think that they can. I'm interested to see, though, what happens in Iowa and New Hampshire. Because one thing that history tells us is that no Republican candidate, a non-incumbent, has ever won both Iowa and New Hampshire in the GOP primary. It's true. It's interesting, but it's true. Because it shows, in Iowa, the voters here are a different group of Republicans. In Iowa, you're talking about the evangelicals, you're talking about faith-based voters, you're talking about more rural voters, and you're talking about an electorate that is fundamentally different than that in New Hampshire. Live free or die. It's the least religious state in the entire country, including amongst Republicans. Very, very, very pro-freedom. Nothing to do with the idea of religion, evangelical ideology. All of that is thrown out of the window in New Hampshire. And it is just a different demographic. Though you're talking about an overwhelming majority of white voters in Iowa and New Hampshire, they care about different things. New Hampshire isn't really rural in the way that Iowa is. New Hampshire isn't religious in the way that Iowa is. New Hampshire isn't campaigned in the same way that Iowa is. It's a primary versus a caucus. Enthusiasm versus energy, right? Those are the things that matter in these states, and that's why candidates never in Republican primary history have ever won both states in an open race. And yet this time, not only will Donald Trump win both, as of right now, he will blow everybody else out of the water. A 33-point advantage in Iowa, a 31-point advantage in New Hampshire. South Carolina, a 33-point advantage. Nevada, a 52-point advantage. Everywhere you look, Trump, 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 Trump. You look at even this most recent poll from Franklin and Marshall, Trump up 41 points in the Pennsylvania Republican primary. This race is over, and Mike Pence's withdrawal from the race is the first step, I think, for many Republicans in recognizing that this race is no longer winnable. Because yes, at one point, I think it was. You can see it in the betting markets too. Ron DeSantis had a lead over Donald Trump for months on end. In the GOP primary too, you can see that Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis were a hell of a lot closer when this primary first started out. Even back in March of 2023, the lead was just 16 points. At one point, narrowed down to 12%. Today, it's 47%. With Mike Pence's exit from the race, I imagine a lot of those voters will go to a candidate like Nikki Haley. I don't think many others really resonate with the Pence crowd other than her and maybe Chris Christie and Tim Scott, but realistically, Nikki Haley, which means the race for second place is going to get closer. But it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, Donald Trump is winning the nomination, and the sooner that people realize that, I think this election can move and transition towards a general. Now, just yesterday, Dean Phillips, a representative from the state of Minnesota, has announced that he's now challenging Joe Biden for the Democratic nomination. I'm interested to see how this ends up because I don't know how effective he will be as a campaigner, how effective or winnable, his race will be. But it's interesting because now maybe we flip-flop to a point where the Democratic primary is competitive and the Republican one just got a lot less, as many candidates are expected to withdraw, and as many of them, even though it was never really competitive in the first place, pull out. It clears the field nearly entirely for President Donald Trump. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.